Morning, team. Hey, we have been doing a little bit of reflecting on our time here in Howick of recent days. And Julie and I have come to love this community. There's no other way of saying it, but we really love the village of Howick. And I say the village of Howick because really Howick is a village that's just been absorbed by the wider Auckland spreading urban sprawl. But there's certain things about Howick which make Howick very, very cool. There's a certain community vibe that you don't get in many other parts of Auckland. I think they try, but they don't kind of succeed. And I love the way in which people can tap into things in Howick for the greater community good. Howick has what I call good leadership, and the sense of community that comes out of that is a response of that, and so we love it. However, in recent days, as I had my full first game of the season for soccer yesterday, so I'm a little bit sore. I'll be limping around. I'm sorry about that. But as I talk with the guys in our soccer team, and as I take Jack to soccer on Tuesday nights where I was, and talking with people there and meeting other people around, there's God's been doing something in me. And if anything, I've come to be a little bit uneasy. And I'm uneasy because I think a lot of what Howick has to offer is a little bit of a facade. And I know those are harsh words, but I think, or I know what God's doing is He is developing a burden in me. The best way that I can explain this is by sharing a story. And Agnes, you'll be rapt because this story takes place in the Scottish Hebrides. Some of you will be aware of this story, but our story begins back in 1949 in the Scottish Hebrides, and it starts with two elderly ladies. Their names were Peggy and Christine Smith, and they were sisters, and they were aged 84 and 82 respectively. And these ladies were just, by society standards, they were normal, everyday people in their senior years. But what happened was they developed, that they just weren't happy with what was going on in their community. And they lived in a community that had a lot of drunkenness, had a lot of wild and reckless living, so they put it. But there were a lot of broken homes. There was a lot of carryover dysfunction, if you like, from the end of World War II. And so what happened was that these two ladies in their senior years started to pray. And they prayed that God would give them a burden for their community. And so they prayed. And they just started praying. They'd meet together and they would pray for their community. As time went on, they both started to sense that God was going to do something special. But it came out of a holy dissatisfaction. And it I think as a church leader, it kind of worries me a little bit about, if I was in this guy's shoes, because the local minister got summoned. And the lady shared with him their burden that they had. And they asked whether he would spearhead calling together other church leaders just to simply pray. And so when you read the historical documentation, you get the feeling that he did it out of courtesy to them to begin with. And he got together with a couple of other church leaders, and they started a regular prayer meeting, of which these ladies were too senior to be at because it was late at night and the whole thing. And so what happened was that as they committed themselves to this, the leaders and the local churches started to get a burden, and there was a sense of expectation that God was going to do something special in their community. Anyway, the local church leader they initially contacted invited a gentleman from the mainland to come and do a series of meetings with them. And his name was Duncan Campbell. And Duncan Campbell was a very, very busy person, and he wrote back and said to them, it's actually going to take probably over a year for me to arrive because I've got all these other things. Anyway, a series of kind of freaky events happened, and he ended up in the islands within a 10-day period. Right? It's just interesting how God does things. And when he arrived, he was shattered. Right? He was really, really tired. And so he was still a little bit bewildered that he kind of ended up there. And so I guess out of courtesy, he did a meeting out of request of the local leaders. And at the end of that meeting, he had written that he wanted to go home and have a sleep. He wanted to go and have a sleep, but he was invited to a prayer meeting. And so out of courtesy, he goes to this prayer meeting, and that prayer meeting started in that afternoon. And I say that because it went on for a while. He went to a small cottage where there were 30 people gathered, and he later described this meeting as he said that they weren't there for very long, and very soon they realized that God was beginning to move within this group. And he wrote, the heavens were opening, we were there on our faces before God, and then it was 3 a.m. in the morning, and God swept in. And about a dozen men and women lay flat on the floor, completely speechless. Something amazing had happened. And he wrote, we knew that the forces of darkness were going to be driven back, and men and women were going to be delivered. Now this here, by the way, is in all the secular encyclopedias. You can look it up in, what is the modern encyclopedia now? Google. You can Google this, and it's all there. But he says, we left the cottage prayer meeting at 3 a.m., so it started at 3 p.m., so what's that, 12-hour prayer meeting, to discover men and women seeking God. And he writes this, I walked along a country road to go home to bed, and I found 3 men on their faces in the middle of the road, crying to God for mercy. I then realized there was a light on in every home, and no one in the whole community was asleep. When Duncan and his friends arrived back at the church in the following morning, so this is a Monday morning, to sort of debrief, the church was crowded. People had gathered from all over the island, some coming in buses and vans, and no one ever discovered who invited them to come. They came without being invited. And on that Monday, large numbers were converted as God's Spirit convicted multitudes of the bad stuff in their lives. Many were lying flat on the floor, and many were weeping. And after that amazing morning in the church, Duncan pronounced the benediction, but then a young man stood and began to pray. And this young man apparently prayed for 45 minutes. Don't go getting any ideas around that, but they did that. And again, people, the first lot went out and the next lot began to come into the church. And this particular service that started around midday went on till 4 a.m. the next morning. Duncan then pronounced the benediction, to which he then writes, there was no time for sleep. Even then, Duncan was unable to go home to bed. As he was leaving the church, a messenger told him, Mr. Campbell, people have completely overwhelmed the police station. They have come to turn themselves in. People are in great spiritual distress. Can anyone please come along and pray with them? So Campbell then left there and went to the police station. And as he did, an amazing sight met him. This was, by the way, It was still dark before sunrise, But under the still starlit sky, he found men and women on the road, others by the side of a cottage, some behind a haystack, all crying to God for mercy. A great revival had come. And Duncan Campbell later wrote, "This went on for 5 weeks, with services from early morning until late at night, every day to accommodate all of the people. Many of the meetings going on into the early hours of the morning. Then it began to spread into neighbouring parishes. And what happened in Barbas was repeated over and over again. Christ's sacred presence was everywhere. That move of God in answer to prevailing prayer continued in the area into the 50s and peaked again on another previously resistant island in 1957. Meetings were again crowded. Oh, can you put up the next one, Mike? Right, because they had to have some temporary tenting that came in. They actually stayed there for 6 years. Right? Meetings were again crowded, and night after night people cried out to God for salvation. Over the 8-year period, thousands of people were saved, and from this revival, hundreds of people became missionaries all over the world. Pubs and taverns were closed, and a number of police officers changed vocations because there was nothing for them to do. All right? This is all in this. You can look it up. It's amazing. And the Hebrides revival, by the way, is considered one of the greatest Christian revivals of all time. Now, why I find that fascinating, I'm just going to chuck this in, is that there were a group of these people that started to pray for the salvation of London. Right? And who should turn up in London in the early 50s to hold a, small number of meetings, but a guy by the name of Billy Graham. Right? It's amazing when you track these things historically. Now, to put all of this in context, which is exciting, is to ask the question, how did it begin? It began with 2 old ladies having a burden for the lost. And they didn't know what to do, so what did they do? They prayed. The question I have for us this morning is, do we have a burden for the lost? What does this mean? It means that you are troubled by the spiritual state of those around you and in wider society. That's what it means. And God sometimes gives us a burden for others. By the way, when you get this, you will not miss it. You will be stressed out by the things that you see. You'll be deeply saddened by the way in which people are living. How that happens for me is this. From time to time, I will be in a crowded place, for example, and I will just have a little snapshot experience. It's like, sometimes when there's a crowd but you're actually alone, where it's almost like it's in slow motion and you look around and you see people's spiritual state. That's the only way that I can explain it. And the only thing you can do with that is pray. Right? But when this happens, I believe it's God's Spirit at work in you, in us. And when this happens, He's including you in becoming part of the solution to these people coming to Him. Right? You just don't go, I felt really strange and I had to shake it off and it's good, I can get on with my life again. Because that's not what He's doing. What He is doing is He's recruiting you in the spiritual war for their salvation. That is what is happening. Don't miss it. Now, the Apostle Paul had this kind of burden for the salvation of Israel. And in the book of Romans, chapter 9, he writes this: I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart for these people. God had given Paul a burden for the people of Israel who were rejecting Christ. The word sorrow here comes from the Greek word that often was used to express the grief and sorrow of losing a loved one. The word anguish is from a Greek word that refers to consuming grief, pain, and sorrow. Have you ever felt your heart sink when you have heard some bad news about someone that you cared about? That's the kind of grief that Paul had for the unsaved Jews who had rejected Christ. In fact, it was probably the driving force behind his missionary zeal. He was driven by a sense of grief and a burden that God had given him. And it was his driving force because he nurtured the burden. Right? He recognized it and he nurtured it. You see, when God gives us a burden for the lost, you and I have two options. We can either suppress the burden, and I think a lot of this actually happens, or we can nurture it. We can suppress the burden in a couple of ways, mainly by putting it off. Sometimes God prompts us at the most inconvenient times. Has anyone ever noticed that? Right? And so our response can become, oh, I'll follow that up later. Right? Or, not now, I'm watching TV. I say that because I think God's burden in our lives can get squashed out by the digital age in which we live because we are training ourselves to just naturally hook into anything that we see visually. And so I've been guilty of this, where I've had some very deep kind of, solving all the problems of the world kind of stuff going on, and then something will come on TV or the screen. I go, oh, I must think about that later on. It's gone. And we miss the moment. Sometimes we suppress the burden because of fear. When I was a teenager, I would have been about 18. I went to church. There's a lady who was my badminton coach, and this particular lady would have been in her mid-50s, an amazing lady, but she carried a lot of just the stress of life with her. Very generous lady, but there was this real deep sense of dissatisfaction in her life, and it grieved me. And what happened was that as time went on, God began to prompt me to pray for this particular lady. And anyway, to cut a long story short, she ended up coming to this particular church service that our church was running. Now, our church at the time really consisted of a group of elderly ladies, me, who was the teenager, and one other young girl. That was kind of church. It was all we were a total of 14. She came along. And it was kind of an unusual Sunday because I remember that there was kind of like a gospel message given, which was quite a rare thing. And this lady was down the back. I could see that she was visibly upset, and God was doing something in me. My heart was going 100 miles an hour. I'd broken out in a sweat, and God was prompting me to go and talk to her. And I'm going, I'm 18 or whatever it was, and this lady's old. What could and so I started entering into this dialogue with God, right? And I kind of had this snapshot as to what I think Moses went through. Because, I often go, if I was in Moses' position, I'd never have done that. Man, he had all that, and I was just having this. But anyway, as the morning went on, I chickened out. I suppressed God's prompting in my life. And it was almost like God was saying, go, I will be with you. I will even speak, that whole thing. And I went, no, this is all just purely psychological, and I'll get back to it later. And I remember this immense feeling, all the stuff that was going on left, just like that. And you know what? Later never came. I was really quite disappointed in myself over that one. And if I'm quite honest, I was gutted. I knew that I'd let both God and her down. And if the truth of the matter is put out there, I had. And I've often thought about that moment over the years. Now, what happened was, from that particular event, as a young person, I determined that I was never ever going to be in that situation again. Right? I determined that. And funnily enough, after I made that determination, God started to prompt me in my final year of high school that I was to pray for my friends at school. And what happened is that I'd be in bed, and in the middle of the night, I would get this prompting, and so I'd get out of bed and I'd pray. And I just did that, really having no idea how all this was going to work, right? But I started to learn to pray that he would set up divine appointments for me, and so that if God was doing something in someone, and if we were talking, that I would recognize what was going on. So, a little while later, I remember this was in about the March of my final year of school. There was a guy that came up to me, and out of the blue, he asked me for a Bible, because this is what happens at school, right? But he asked me for a Bible, right? Now, don't laugh, but I had one, as you do, and I gave him this Bible, and I said to his name is Paul. I said to, what do you want it for? You know, because it's a bit suspect. I thought he might have been wanting it to light cigarettes or something, but no. He said, oh, I want to read it. And I want to read it because then I'm going to tell you what a load of junk this Christianity stuff is. And so it's like, okay, that prompts you to prayer, right? Because the thing about this particular guy was he was a lighthouse genius. Sorry, not was, still is probably. But this is the guy that I sat next to in maths class, and he gets 96% in a major test, goes back to the teacher, argues a point, and comes out with 99%. Absolutely disappointed that it wasn't 100%, right? Unlike me, who gets 26%, go and argue a point and come out with, 19% or something. But he was just very gifted in this way. So I was praying for him, and not only that, there was a prompting that was going on, and I was responding to that prompting. About 2 or 3 weeks later, I'd kind of sort of was praying, but was sort of semi-avoiding because of, this, man is going to hammer me, the whole thing. And but what happened is that I caught up with him, and I remember walking out onto the field, and I asked him this question. I said, how's the Bible reading going? And he looked at me with tears, and he said, last night I gave my heart to the Lord in my room, right? I wasn't prepared for that, I didn't see that one coming, And so this was really, really cool. And so what happened was we began to hatch this game plan about some of our other mates. And it turned out that the Lord really convicted and brought to him an evangelist. And how that translated was, I used to be this Christian geeky guy who went to church by myself on a Sunday night, and I'd sneak in the back of this church, and no one really talked to you, the whole thing. And I'm just putting it out there. And by the way, it's almost like God was showing me this is not what church should be like, all right? But anyway, so I went there, and I was doing this for a while. Then Paul started coming, and others who had got saved were coming, and by the end of the year, there were 3 or 4 carloads of us coming to church. And the great thing about that is that these kids were not from Christian homes, right? And God was, because Paul was saying to me, he says, man, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was almost like I felt I had to pray, and and so, because you have to understand, when you're young, you're going, okay, so what does God want to, make disciples, what does that mean, and you're sort of trying to figure all this out when you're younger. And it started this chain reaction with people who were very credible people within the school. And it was incredibly exciting. But what it was simply a response to the fact that God had given me a burden, and I nurtured that burden. It leads to an obvious question. How do we nurture a burden for the lost? Right? The most important thing in this, I believe, is simply to pray and ask, Lord, give me a burden for the lost. If you don't have one, ask for one. And then when you get one, pray that you will know what to do. This is a great lesson, by the way, in learning to follow the promptings of the Holy Spirit in your life when you pray. Look, the simple fact is we should all be praying for those who don't know Christ anyway. But sometimes God will call you to pray specifically for someone at a specific time. You need to learn to tune into this, and you need to train yourself to respond. Why? Because, trust me, it's going to come in an inconvenient time. And it's because sometimes God has to move in that particular moment, and he calls us to pray for it. Another way, by the way, of nurturing the burden is to take time to immerse yourself in the bigger story of the biblical narrative. And the reason for that is that you start to learn all about your place in the story, and you start to put two and two together about the way in which God moves and why he does and the way he prompts us. It's all part of that. But when you get a burden, you need to nurture it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a clip, and I'm going to show you a clip that is entitled Who Cares? Some of you have seen this clip, but back in the 1800s, this crazy guy who was one of the founders of the Salvation Army began to pray for a burden for the lost. And it was William Booth, and he was actually traveling at the time, and he felt that he had sort of hit a bit of a dry spot in where he was going through, and he said that he needed to have a refreshing of himself and what God has called him to do. And as he was traveling, he had a vision. And I want to show you a dramatized version of that now.
I had a vision. I saw a dark and stormy ocean. In that ocean, I thought I saw multitudes of poor human beings plunging and floating and shouting and shrieking, cursing and struggling and drowning. And out of this dark, angry ocean, I saw a mighty rock that rose up with its summit towering high above the stormy seas. And all round the base of the rock, I saw a vast platform. And on this platform I saw with delight a number of the poor wretches continually climbing out of the angry ocean. And I saw that some of those who were already safe on the platform were fervently helping the poor creatures still in the angry waters to reach safety. But something puzzled me. Although they had all been rescued at one time or another from the ocean, nearly everyone seemed to have forgotten all about it. Anyway, the memory of its darkness and danger no longer troubled them. And what was equally strange and perplexing to me was that most of these people did not seem to have any care, that is, any agonizing care, about the poor perishing ones who were struggling and drowning right before their eyes. But then I saw something wonderful. I saw a great being from above come straight from his palace, right through the dark clouds. And he leapt right into the raging sea among the drowning people. And there I saw him toiling to rescue them until the sweat of his great anguish ran down in blood. And he was continually crying to those already rescued, to those whom he had helped with his own bleeding hands, to come and help him in the painful and laborious task of saving the lost. But the strangest thing of all was that those on the platform to whom he called were so taken up with their trades and professions and money saving and pleasures and families and community and gatherings and religions and arguments about it that they did not respond to the cry that came to them from this wonderful being who had himself by his Spirit gone down into the sea. And so the multitude went on struggling and shrieking and drowning in the darkness. And then I saw something that seemed stranger than anything that had happened before in this very strange vision. Those whom this wonderful being cried out to come and help him in his difficult task, were always praying and crying to him to come to them. Some wanted him to come and stay with them and spend his time and strength in making them happier. Others wanted him to come and take away various doubts and misgivings they had concerning the truth of some letters which he had written them. Others wanted him to come and make them feel more secure on the rock, so secure that they would be totally sure they would never slip off again. They used to meet and get as close to the rock as they could, and looking towards the mainland where they thought the great being was, they would cry out, "Come to us, come and help us." But all this time he was down among the poor drowning creatures, crying to them in a hoarse voice, "Come to me, come and help me." And then I understood it all. It was plain enough. That sea was the ocean of life, the sea of real actual human existence. Those multitudes of people struggling in the stormy sea were the billions of sinners from every race, language, and nation. That great sheltering rock was Calvary, the place of the cross, and the people on it were those who had been rescued from sin and hell and who professed to be followers of Jesus Christ. That mighty being who called to them from the tempest was the Son of God, the same yesterday, today, and forever, who is still struggling to save the dying multitudes about us from this terrible doom of damnation, and whose voice can be heard above the music and machinery and noise of life, calling on the rescued to come and help him save the world. My friends in Christ, you are rescued from the waters. You are on the rock. Jesus is in the dark sea, calling on you to come and help him. Will you go?
I'm going to ask the music team to come forward at this point. And as they come, my question for you this morning, normally I wouldn't ask people to respond to a clip, all right? But I want you to ask the question to yourself is, where are you represented in that clip? Maybe this morning you are someone who is in the ocean. Maybe you are someone languishing in the stormy sea of life and you are going down. My encouragement for you this morning is that as we saw in that clip, Christ is closer to you than you can ever possibly imagine. And so I'm going to put it out there. If you would like to commit your life to Christ this morning, then as we have our team sing, I would love you to come forward to our mercy seat, our place of prayer, and someone will explain what the gospel is and lead you through that this morning. For the rest of you who are in Christ, those of you who are Christ followers, those of you who have been pulled from the stormy sea of fear and destruction, how is your burden for the lost? The book of Romans makes it very clear that we should have a burden for lost souls. How's your burden this morning? Maybe you're like the people on the platform in that clip who have taken their eye off the ball. Remember, once upon a time you were pulled out of that sea. And I firmly believe that God is calling us to be involved in pulling others out. How's that going for you this morning? Do you remember the text that Jules read from Matthew 5? And this is Jesus speaking. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. See, the people who are on that platform were hiding their light. Do you ever get concerned that there are people around the world and in our community who are lost and who don't have the peace of Christ in their lives? You know? Are you concerned about the people in Waterloo Street, in Wellington Street? Because you see, people often want to be missionaries and go off to far countries and all. There's nothing wrong with that. But actually, we are here in this community at a particular time in history. My hunch, it has something to do with the local people around us. Do you share the Apostle Paul's sorrow? Maybe you remember a time when you were more concerned and burdened about the lost. Has your concern and your passion grown cold? A real test of your level of concern can be seen in your action. Are you praying for the lost? Are you witnessing to the lost, or at least inviting them to church? If you realize that your burden for the lost has been minimal or grown cold, then I ask you to take a fresh look at what happens to lost souls. Right now, this became so aware to me yesterday. Many of the people who don't have the peace of Christ in their lives are looking for solutions in unhealthy places. They try to fill this emptiness of their souls with the immediate pleasures of life and material possessions. And it will at some point in their lives leave them empty. Then the day will come when they will die. Then what? What happens then? Do you care about the lost? And I'm just putting it out there. I'm calling every believer in this room this morning to renew your commitment to pray for someone you know, or for those in your sphere of influence who don't know the peace of Christ. And if you don't have a burden for the lost, then get one. Sorry, I'm just putting it out there. Seek God on this matter. And I believe as a community, we need to seek from God a new or renewed passion for the lost. And maybe some of you will come forward this morning to pray for a burden for our community. Maybe you would like to pray for someone specifically that you know. Maybe you would like to pray for a divine opportunity. That is, ask God to set up a meeting with someone who doesn't know him, ask him to prompt you when it's happening, and help you to know what to say. And can I tell you, that is one of the most amazing adventures in life. How's your burden this morning? The music team are now going to lead us in the song Amazing Grace. May I remind you, the words go, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. What are you doing with this amazing